Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this month's webinar hosted by the Wisconsin Cheesemakers Association. My name is Danica Nilsen-Stewart. I'm WCMA's Director of Sustainability and Grants, and I'm so glad to have you with us today as we dive into dairy exporting, navigating economic cycles in a changing world. First, a couple of housekeeping notes. Please make sure you keep your mics muted and your video off to avoid interruptions during the webinar. Please feel free to submit questions anytime during the session, and we'll do our best to address them during Q&A at the end. I'd like to point out that we have a jam-packed agenda today, so there is a slight chance we may not get to Q&A at the end, but we will make sure to share contact information for our speakers. A recording of this webinar, along with a list of resources, will be shared later this week, so watch for that in your email inbox. So with that, we will get here onto our agenda. So as you can see from our agenda, we have a very meaty list of topics to cover. So we're going to get going right away. I am not going to read this whole agenda to you. I want to get us off to our first speaker right away because we've got a lot to talk about. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Andy Novakovic, the Emeritus Professor of Dairy Economics from Cornell University, and he's going to get us going today with a really interesting conversation. So I'm going to stop sharing quick so he can share his slides.
Oh, yes, which we said as if that was just going to work so straightforward. Can you see him?
Yep, looks great.
Okie dokie. All right. So my task today, my objective today, is to really talk about what sort of role tariffs have played historically, and see if there's some lessons that we can learn from what we might expect to be an experience now. Things that worked in the past, will they work now? Things that really never were part of the past, could they be something that happens today? And I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges of adjusting to tariffs, although that's going to be a little bit more the responsibility of my colleagues on the panel. One of the things I think is useful to seem to have skipped a slide. Yeah. One of the things that I think is useful to appreciate, and it's something that I think all of us know, but I'm not sure we all fully appreciate, how absolutely remarkably different the federal government and its role and our concept of the responsibilities of the federal government changed in the 1930s, obviously under the leadership of Franklin Roosevelt, but presidents don't get to pass laws, Congresses have to. So it was really a broad governmental effort that took quite a while to unfold. But what we thought about ourselves as a federal government just astonishingly changed at that moment in time. Prior to then, the idea of what the federal government did was really quite differentiated from the constituent states. And the idea was really to focus on international stuff, diplomacy, defense, and some big infrastructure stuff like having a common currency and a banking system, which, oh, by the way, that isn't how it all started. In the beginning of the country, we didn't have a central bank. It took quite a while before we all agreed to have a dollar and to have a national banking system. And then the federal government played a role in where there were disputes between states or a shared waterway or something like that. And of course, as we expanded further and further into North America, a lot of those expansions were claimed as federal government land and so on. Entirely very different. And at that juncture in time, which we're really talking about over 130 years of history of the country, tariffs were the primary source of revenue. Again, we didn't need a lot of revenue, but what we did have was the lion's share was actually from tariffs. We had some excise taxes, which is like a sales tax, the tax you pay on alcohol and gasoline, for example, are an excise tax. And there was some revenue from selling so-called federal land, which we appropriated as we went west. But tariffs were the big part of that. Uh, Again, uh, we didn't have a lot of expenses, but we could cover them primarily with those rather limited sources of revenue. Where we first introduced income taxes was during the Civil War, and it was actually fairly late in the Civil War when Congress implemented an income tax, and that income tax was collected until fairly well into the Reconstruction period, again because there were unusual, extraordinary expenses. But then, of course, it wasn't until around the time of World War One that we began seeing uh, a, a need to have another source of revenue, and income taxes were chosen. This is a graph that shows both expenditures and sources of receipts for the federal fiscal year 2024, ending on September 30th, 2024. And I simply give it to give a sense of what the relative balance is today. And as you can see, excise taxes, I guess, rank fourth, but it's a pretty distant fourth by comparison to those above it. The customs duties are the fifth, and that's what tariff revenue comes from. And it's also a pretty thin slice. If you kind of look over to the middle where you've got those kind of sort of parallel lines, you'll see a little orange or brownish segment that's called the deficit. This isn't the national debt. This is the deficit between expenditures and sources in any particular year. And I think it gives you a pretty good sense of scale. If we really wanted to close the gap on that deficit, it would, it's the same amount of money whether you add it as income taxes or corporate taxes or whatever. But it's a pretty heavy lift to put all that on tariffs. If we take a look, I said we had pretty high tariff rates historically, and this gives us a sense of that. This graph goes back to 1820, and it shows two lines. One is the so-called average tariff rate relative to everything that we import. And secondly, the orange line is the average tariff rate for everything for which the tariff is greater than zero. And this is real simple math. You just say, take all of the revenue you collect from tariffs and divide it by the value of the imports as it's brought into the country. And that ratio is considered the average tariff rate. There are other calculations that are just a simple average. This is obviously more along the line of a weighted average. So if you're looking at different numbers, you want to be sure which one you're getting. But this sort of weighted average tariff rate is I think the more meaningful one. Part of what this says is, oh my gosh, we're talking about a lot higher tariffs. So we see lots of time periods in there where the average tariff rate against every good is in the 20 to 30% range. If we look just at the things where the tariff is applied, it pops up towards 50%. And then all towards the right-hand side of the graph, that really starts to drop off. And this is reflecting, I think, two things. One, a different concept of what we should be doing with tariffs, what role should they properly play, but also a different idea or a different concept about the importance of promoting international trade. Early in the country's history, we employed arguments that might be described as the infant country argument and the infant industry argument. And if, obviously, it wasn't really until World War II that we were recognized as an economic juggernaut within the globe. And prior to World War II, that wasn't really so much how we were seen, even with the experience of World War I. And certainly in the early days of the country, we're just this remote little colony that barely won its war of independence against the great power of England. nobody really saw us as having a lot of muscles to flex. And so the idea of having some protection with tariffs as an infant country was, understandable, logical, and it's a concept that still pertains to developing countries around the world. A somewhat similar but more focused argument was the infant industry one. So, for example, there were industries in the US where we had a pretty obvious natural advantage. That was primarily agriculture. That was what the United Kingdom really saw as its big advantage for us as a colony. But when you start thinking about other sorts of manufacturing, we were hard pressed to compete toe to toe with
I
those
was hoping to get it over
establishments
there.
in the UK or Europe. And so the infant industry, protecting those industries was a pretty popular concept. Today, of course, this idea of protecting an industry, either as an infant or something else, is still a part of our logic. You hear that argument, especially in the developing world, and it's to some extent a part of the logic now. Not maybe so much infant industry, but sort of resuscitating industry. The One of the things that I think it's important also to get a handle on is how do we measure economic activity between countries? And uh, the big picture concept is referred to as the balance of payments. And balance of payments is really simply measuring money going out and money coming in, credits and debits measured in dollars. And part of that is exports of goods and imports of goods, but it's really only a part of it. The part that relates to things that we sell, products that we sell, is called the balance of trade as opposed to the balance of payments. And even that has at least two parts. One is physical things, sometimes referred to as visible trade or goods trade. And that's the thing that we've been hearing so much recently is, where do the cars get produced? Where do we buy tomatoes from, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's about goods. A huge part of our trade, however, is in services. And, these are legitimate products of our economy, but we don't trade things that you can carry around in a tote. You trade services. And there is plenty of that occurs. In fact, in general picture, we are a net importer of goods, but we're pretty close to a net exporter on services. That number toggles back and forth a little bit, but in the main, I think we could say we're primarily a net exporter of services. The other part of the balance of payments, though, is money flows. And this comes in the form of investments or borrowing. And you can read the slide. I don't think I need to get too deep into that, but it's again basically tracking money that goes out or money that comes in. So when we have a foreign company investing in the United States, like BMW comes to South Carolina or Honda goes to Ohio or whatever, for that matter, dairy examples, uh, companies that invest in the US, that's bringing dollars from outside the US into the United States. Foreign direct investment is a plus. And so a lot of what keeps our balance of payments level, which is actually by definition, the balance of payments must equal zero, is the movement of dollars, not the movement of goods. That is illustrated in this slide, which focuses on the balance of trade in goods only. Again, if I showed you a slide of balance of payments, that would just be a line across zero where the only deviation was some statistical discrepancy, error of measurement kind of thing. But if we look at just the balance of trade, focusing only on goods, not on services, this is the chart from the late 1800s, 1895, until 2015, which happened to be the only slide I could find that went back that far, so you can get sort of the breadth of it. But and as you can see, the by and large, our balance of trade in goods was positive, certainly bounced up and down a bit, but around 1970, that changed. And it sort of begs the question, so what the heck was going on at that point in time? One thing I will point out, as long as we're looking at this graph at the moment, is our decision to not only open our doors, but to get into a global agreement for everybody to open their doors and reduce trade restrictions. That began after World War II. So that really started in 1947. And like anything, it started slow and built up. But the point is, 1970 isn't when we opened the doors for low tariffs and free trade. That started 30 years before that. So uh, maybe tariffs play some role in this slide, but there's got to be something else going on because we had low tariff rates earlier. And the previous slide that I showed you that had those tariff lines certainly indicate that. So there, I don't know how many people in sort of casual conversation had the foggiest idea what smooth Holly was back in the 30s and 40s. That was a pretty familiar thing and was kind of held up as a bit of a boogeyman. But most folks wouldn't have any reason to remember it. We're hearing those words much more so. But basically, that was the last high watermark for tariffs in the US. And it was an idea that was offered by folks who saw it as a solution to the emerging Great Depression. And the general gist of the logic was the Great Depression is, at least in some part, due to an excess supply. We're seeing depression, right? Prices are going down, the opposite of inflation. Why do prices go down? Because you got supply chasing demand. You've got too much of stuff and not enough people buying it. Why is that? Well, there's a good question, and if you knew the answer perfectly, you could tailor your solution. But if all you know is prices are going down and supply is chasing demand, there were a lot of folks who thought, well, the answer to that's pretty simple. You just dampen down supply. And we did that in various ways. It was actually a big part of our agricultural policy in the New Deal to try to shrink supply. But this notion of the high tariffs preceded the changeover in administration in 1933 and was implemented thinking, oh, this is a little solution to our economic problem. There's debates among economists as to whether or not this helped. Usually the question is more like, how bad did it hurt? My best read of the literature now is that it definitely didn't help, but probably in the grand scheme of things, it didn't make things any worse than they were going to be anyway. But it gives us at least some sort of reference point on what are we talking about in terms of levels of tariffs today. And indeed, what on earth are we talking about levels of tariffs today? Because that story seems to change from one day to the next, if not morning to the afternoon. But I can say what is in place at this particular moment in time that's affecting trade at the border as we speak is in the neighborhood of 20%, plus or minus. This chart is suggesting 14.5. I've seen other estimates at 22. Obviously, it's a little hard to know because the level of imports is a moving target. If we're really effective in restraining imports, then obviously our collections of money is going down. It's that part diminishes, and the average tariff rate is going to start looking different. If tariffs keep coming in anyway, we'll collect a lot of revenue because they're still coming in. So it's a little hard to use old data to project new effects when you're looking at something like this. That's really kind of an outlier. But let's just say we're in the neighborhood of the high water mark for the 20th century. How does all this relate to the national economy? Well, again, that's a good question. If we look at this chart, which is just looking at gross domestic product since the late 19th century, well over 100 years, and if we keep in mind that the sort of the freer, definitely not free, but freer trade regime started after World War II, I think visually we'd have to say that there hasn't been big negative effects. And arguably, you could say, well, it's kind of positive. We've had not so deep recessions. We've had plenty of periods of growth and prosperity. To say that that has something to do or is entirely explained by tariffs would be absurd. But it at least allows us to say, is there a before and after relative to tariffs that we can see by taking a look at the performance of the national economy? And I would say, yeah, not really, but if you see anything, it looks more good than it does bad. If we think about the arguments for should we have freer trade, should we have more trade restrictions, what's the good and the bad? And I'm sure a lot of you have read this if you've read various commentaries about folks that are excited one way or another. The general feeling among the kind of core economics community is that the virtue of free trade is it allows businesses in all countries to focus on what they do best. And there's something I'm going to do that I can do better than you can. But, by definition, there's got to be something you can do that provides a basis for trade. So I'll do what I do best, and you do what you do best, and then we can swap things back and forth, and everybody wins. The other kind of underlying understanding is when you have a restriction on trade, whether it's a tariff like a sales tax or some other restriction like a quota, you're introducing a cost. And just sort of, I think our natural instinct, especially if you work in the business world, is that costs are a drag on commercial activity. It's a restraint, a reduction in economic activity. The pie shrinks, so to speak. So, well, okay. So who are there winners? Are there losers? One of the things that economists like to talk about is to say uh, buyers are the winners, consumers are the winners because they get stuff at a lower price than it would have been if we didn't allow some other country to focus on what they do well and give us the opportunity to buy it. On the producer side, it's more obvious that there are winners and losers. There are companies and industries that grow. There are companies and industries that can't compete. We don't make T-shirts in North Carolina. We let a lot of other countries manufacture steel for us, and et cetera, et cetera. And the concept in economics that tries to help us think whether or not that's good or bad is to say, are the wins bigger than the losses? If all the winners completely compensated the losers for what they lost and there was still something left over, then it worked. It was a good idea. Let's do it. The problem is we don't actually compensate, or to the extent that we do with retraining programs and adjustment assistance and so on, falls a little short of making folks feel like they actually um, uh, uh, were part of the winning group, or at least weren't hurt. We can think about how does this relate to investments? How does this relate to other aspects of performance that we're going to evaluate? I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about the national debt. This chart shows us the national debt from 1900 to projecting into 2050. And you look and you can see war years where we had some pretty big spikes, but then all of a sudden it seems to go out of control. Again, I would point out that we started freeing up trade in the late 1940s. So there's a big chunk of this slide where there was no kind of correlation between trade policy and this, but then all of a sudden we get this spike in the 1980s, a little back off in the 2000s, and then ramping up. And my point here is this is really a reflection of fiscal policy. Pretty hard to connect this to trade policy. And I think what I would say is I see a Congress and a president, but really fiscal policy is the Congress, trying to avoid the hard decisions of how to balance taxes with expenditures. And I get that that's hard, but the reason why we have this is because we can't really come to grips with the fiscal policy responsibility of balancing income and expenditures. I don't see a lot of evidence that this connects to trade policy. The last thing I'll mention, and this is, kind of a free throw, I suppose. I'm not claiming to be an expert on business, and certainly not your business, but we have a very uncertain environment for all kinds of reasons at the moment, and uncertainty is a cost. I'm sure I don't have to explain that to you, and we don't want any more costs in our system than we need. I would also say distrust is a deterrent to business relationships, and unfortunately, we're building some distrust. And you can shoot me as the messenger, but all you have to do is read some of the news stories that are coming out of Europe and Canada and Mexico and our trading partners, Japan, to understand that there's some beyond concern about actions that are taken. And this, I think, adds to our challenge as a business. If I were uh, bold enough to offer some ideas, I would say we want to avoid, feeling woe is me. We want to figure out how to be resilient and do our best. And I think we have to keep coming back to, are we providing an affordable, high quality product at a reasonable price as my product, a solution to your needs, and to convey that message? This is made in America, and it's something that we stand by. The other thing I think is to work on the trust side and to just say, look, I know it's a confusing time. There's lots of stuff going on, but one thing you can count on is me and my integrity and reliability as a business partner, and let's not lose sight of that. I think we may need to be more selective. I think we may need to be a little bit more short term. I don't see a lot of big deals made long term. I think there's going to be a lot of singles, maybe a few doubles in the game. But I think we want to focus on what we can do and not get too hung up on what's harder to do. And with that, I'll turn it over. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andy. I was very excited to have that bit of a history lesson before we launched into what's happening now to get some perspective on where we've been and kind of where we are and where we're headed. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Chuck Nicholson, who will give us that very important update, which I know changes by the minute.
Hey, thank you very much.
Welcome, Dr. Nicholson.
Thanks a lot, Danica. And thanks to Andy for providing what I think is a really nice historical perspective on how where we are now or have been in the last few months is actually quite different than where we've been pretty much in the entire post-World War II generation. I'm going to make this maybe a little bit more specific to dairy, and I guess in some ways I think I have maybe the least important part of what you're going to hear today, because a lot of it you probably have already seen or heard already. But it's fairly important to think about tariffs in dairy, and this is a slide that I poached from Everegg. Thank you very much if any of you are watching this, that highlight the export partner market share, including the fact that by value or by volume, our three main trading partners are Mexico, Canada, and China. You can throw Japan and some of the other Asian countries in there as well, and you cover a large proportion of the share of the value that we have exported. If I can ask you, Danica, to go ahead and advance. I think actually maybe there was one slide that was missing at the beginning. Is it possible to go back maybe a couple? Did some get missed? No? Okay. Well, I did have a slide in there that was trying to say why are tariffs and trade important in addition to this. Most of you are aware that most of the growth in the U.S. dairy industry's sales has taken place through expansion of export markets. Depending on how you measure it, we can think about the total volume of components, particularly on a non-fat solids basis, as being more than 1/5 of the total. And again, the key export markets for a lot of these products that we export are ones that have been highlighted in sort of the recent policy statements and also in the press reporting about where we've been. Now, if you go ahead and move it forward to the next one, that'd be great. So as the administration was getting started back in January, I became interested in trying to understand a little bit about the potential impacts of trade and other policies. And I put something out on our Dairy Markets and Policy website that tried to think about an assessment of sort of representative policy options. That is not necessarily what specifically the government was saying they would do or actually had done, but tried to evaluate sort of a generally higher tariff environment for dairy exports, both for things that other countries would do in retaliation for any tariffs we would put in place, as well as our own tariff barriers that would increase costs for machinery and other things like that. And this was, again, a very early initial assessment, and it's actually fairly sobering to think about the size of changes in something like an all milk price, dairy farm revenues, cumulative net farm operating income for dairy farms in the United States being pretty markedly negatively affected by these potential policies. And then what maybe perhaps most importantly, the bottom line there that talks about the value of U.S. dairy product exports being down quite considerably. And that number of something like 5 billion may look pretty high compared to an $8 to $9 billion average, and it is. But another thing that's important to keep in mind is when we do this kind of modeling work, we can actually project forward that there was probably going to be some growth in trade as a result of the kinds of restrictions that other exporting countries would put in place. And therefore, there was a bigger opportunity for us in the next 4 to 5 years to think about growing those export markets. And this is kind of being reflected in the values that you see there that are pretty substantively negative. Maybe also notice there may be some benefits to dairy farms, particularly if we also have issues with exporting corn and soybeans. In some ways, I feel pretty bad for the soybean guys, that 125% tariff in China. But that actually provides some potential cost offsets in terms of lower feed costs in dairy farms, which can provide some kind of relief from the tariff policies that have been put in place. So kind of a sobering story to tell in terms of the potential kinds of impacts. If I can have you go to the next slide. Okay. So part of what I wanted to do, and Andy mentioned this quite well, is everybody is getting whiplash at how much things are changing so quickly. I've actually stopped looking at news except like maybe once a week because otherwise you're not really fully up to date in some sense. But the bottom line is that the primary restraints on trade for major export destinations for dairy products really come about now because of Canada and China. Canada has the 25% tariffs that have been in place, not so much retaliating against anything we did on dairy, although dairy tariffs in Canada have been a major point of attention and also some justification for the U.S. needing to do something with its own tariff policies. And most of you are also aware of the ratcheting up of the percentage tariffs with China. Okay. So those, at least as I understand it today, are sort of the main places where U.S. dairy exports are going to face additional tariff challenges. Mexico, and Andy mentioned this also a little bit, Mexico said, hey, we're going to try and keep our cool and not do anything in response to the things that you're doing to us. But on the other hand, we're not going to completely rule out that we won't do that at some point in the future. Okay, so our main dairy export destination has for the moment generally held off on doing anything in retaliation for dairy or other products. If you can advance one other slide. And dairy dodged a little bit of a bullet with the European Union because they initially said that they were going to have retaliatory tariffs that would affect dairy. And then after some internal discussions, reached a consensus that dairy and alcoholic drinks from the United States would be exempt from these additional retaliatory tariffs. So the main places, again, that we are left with are really Canada and China as being the places where U.S. dairy products are going to cost more, sometimes considerably more as a result of those tariff barriers. Okay. So if you now go to the next to the slides here, and this will really kind of be my end game story here. And we turn it over to Jackie to say something about what to do in this new environment. But I updated the analysis that I had talked about earlier to be better reflective of the tariffs that are in place against U.S. dairy products, those retaliatory tariffs by Canada and China. We have an economic simulation model that allows us to look at global dairy supply chains. I've used it for a number of different research projects in the past. It was originally supported with funding from the International Trade Commission to actually help support trade policy negotiations for dairy. But with the policies in place with Canada and China, still a fairly sobering picture there in terms of the percentage changes that we might expect over the next 4 years in dairy product exports value, cheese and whey export values, kind of in that same range, but bracketed based on which particular product that you're thinking about there. So the potential is still there, even with the Canada and China tariffs being more specifically analyzed for some pretty substantive reductions in the value of U.S. dairy product exports. One of the things that I'll point out is this is not just about tariffs that Canada and China have put in place. It's also about some of the macroeconomic adjustments, including things like exchange rates, interest rates, costs of equipment in the United States, that are also affected by these tariff policies. And in some ways, they actually have sort of a bigger weight in terms of thinking about what these outcomes look like than the specific country-to-country tariffs that we're looking at with Canada and China. So this is sort of laying out the context for future exports. And now I think we can turn it over to Jackie to say a little bit about what strategies are going to be more effective. But thanks a lot for that.
Thank you, Chuck and Andy. It was super informative. And so really laid the groundwork as to why tariffs are used and kind of the impact they can have, and a bit of an insight as to what the landscape looks as of this moment. But really what I want to focus on is what can we do in these uncertain times? How can I protect myself and even maybe see this as an opportunity? So I'll have you go to the next slide, Danica. So one thing that Andy had already touched on, but there are two things that we can still do in these uncertain times. One, diversifying your product, making your product still relevant. Are there products that you can offer that maybe are a little bit of a niche compared to your competitors in other regions? But really cultivating the relationships with foreign buyers. It's easy to ignore buyers and markets that maybe aren't in a position to buy from you at the moment because tariffs are so high. But really, you want to foster those relationships and maintain them, because as we have seen, this can change overnight, and you really want to remain that trusted supplier for these buyers. And this can also be a little bit of a test for your buyers to see how trustworthy and how committed you are as a partner. So even if commercially it doesn't make sense for them to buy from you at the moment, stay in touch. Let them know that they're still important to you, and maintain that close relationship, because essentially you want them to pick up the phone and call you first when the opportunity comes back. And typically when it does so quickly. So you want to be ready for that time. Adopt a problem-solving mentality. And I really do believe that this is an area where Wisconsin cheesemakers have a little bit of a benefit. We have master cheesemakers, we have expertise within the dairy, and typically are a bit more nimble than some of the huge producers, more so on the West Coast. And so I think this is really something that can set Wisconsin cheesemakers apart, but you have to be willing. And I'll go into a bit more of that, how we can do that in the later slides. But work closely with customers. We hear a lot on the news, but what's the sentiment in market? Talk to people on the floor, talk to your distributors and your traders. They're every day engaging with people around the world. They can even maybe help guide you into what markets are more open to doing business within the US at the moment. So really stay in touch and stay informed by the conversations. And that also helps you cultivate those relationships. Excuse me, those relationships. Danica, I'll have you go on to the next slide. So peeling back the layers, it's easy to just hear, okay, tariffs, and I can't sell into that country anymore. But there's so much more to it, especially as these negotiations evolve and they start to cherry pick what products they're going to start to, tariff heavily, and what products maybe there are exemptions for. Really understand, have a deep understanding as to which HS codes are affected, and in order to do so, you obviously need to understand your HS codes. The other thing is standards of identity. The US is very sophisticated in the standards of identity for dairy, and it can vary by country. So have a deep understanding as to the foreign countries that you're selling to, what are their standards of identity, and are there, can that affect your HS code classifications? The other one being understand the country tariff and the quota system. If they start to issue licenses, who are those license holders? In the US, for example, every April, there's a list released of all of the license holders of the cheeses and the butters. It comes with company name and email, and there is a similar system in some other countries. Find those license holders, build relationships with those license holders. Those can be keys to you importing into certain countries that even have tariffs. And then as you start, these negotiations start to happen, and maybe certain exemptions are made, there might be opportunities for you to find certain HS codes that are exempt, that maybe fall into a lower tariff. And you can really have your R&D and regulatory work closely together to see, okay, maybe if I tweak this a little bit, is there something that we can do to lower the tariff and fall into a different HS code? And that can be big opportunities, and can really give you kind of a competitive advantage into certain markets. I'll have you go to the next slide, Danica. So as of today, there is an overarching tariff, obviously, and we're still waiting to see what the retaliatory tariffs are going to be. A lot of countries have said, I'm not looking to impose any retaliatory tariffs. Others are open to negotiation. And then, of course, you have the case of China and Canada that are looking to throw in some retaliatory tariffs, but it's quite uncertain at the moment. So what can I do today for business that I'm doing into markets that are under negotiation, where dairy might be hit with tariffs while I have product on the water? So, it's easy to shy away from it, but let's face it, export is a big part of our business and what we do. So I want to give you some tools and things that you can do today to kind of protect yourself in case tariffs get put onto your products as you're doing business currently. So the big one, transparency is key. Your customers have the same concerns that you do, so talk about it. Lay it out there. What if this happens? Kind of play the worst case scenario and come up with a plan. The other thing you can do is ask for partial prepayment or do letter of credit. It just gives you an extra level of security. The buyer has some extra skin on the game, which maybe if tariffs get hit while product is on the water, it'd be less likely to back out of a deal. Alternatively, you can carry credit insurance. There's many different types of credit insurance, and I would highly, highly recommend that if you're not doing prepayment or letters of credit, you must carry credit insurance, because if a customer decides not to pay you, you're still protected, and you can file a claim, and again, there's many different, if you have any or if you would like any recommendations on who to talk to on that, please reach out. I'd be happy to help. And then include a clause in the sales orders. So consignee bears any additional tariff costs. Again, this is something you want to discuss prior to. It's not something you want to just kind of throw in there. But be in agreement as to who would cover the cost if additional tariffs are applied. And the other thing is if you're understand your Incoterms. Where does your responsibility end? Are you selling as delivered duty paid, in which case you would be responsible for tariff costs? But I would highly recommend selling more CIF, which is cost insurance freight. So your responsibility ends at the port, and the customer is responsible for the clearance and the paying of the duties. So just again, understand the Incoterms, where and how your responsibility ends in the transaction. Monitor trade policy changes. This is kind of hard to keep track of at the moment because they're changing so quickly. But this is where, again, stay in touch with your buyers overseas and understand the local countries' tariffs and HS codes. I'll have you go to the next slide, Danica. So here's some helpful resources and links, and I'm happy to send these out. But again, HS lookup tool, really to even be able to tell what tariffs are applied, you need to know your HS codes. So that one, it's a search engine. You can plug in cheese or cheddar cheese, and it gives you the HS code. Make sure that you read the chapters in between. It comes with a guide as well as to how to interpret the HS codes. Again, the first 6 digits are international. The last 4 are regional. So, be sure that you understand your foreign countries' HS codes as well. US Deck, for anyone who's a member, is a very helpful resource. Their Volume 1 Tariffs and Classifications is a great tool. You can plug in the country and the HS code that you're using, and then it will give you the exact tariffs as well as other resources associated with exporting to that country. And they're very good about keeping it up to date, which is invaluable in this market. There's tariffs and country by product. So WTO, you can kind of, it's another tool that you can use to explore which tariffs are used. That's available to anyone. And then the MAC map is a great tool as well, because it doesn't just cover the tariffs, but it also covers non-monetary barriers to trade, such as health certificates or other testing and things like that. And then the WITS just is more of a tool for data, trade flows, things like that. So it's just, if you're looking for what market maybe should I look into next, it just gives you a nice insight as to kind of the history of trade into other countries. I'll have you go to the next slide, Annika. This is just a screenshot of the US Deck Volume 1. You can see the HS code for cheese. It tells you the taxes. I selected China. Obviously, that's going to be a big one. But you can see down there the tariff, 170% total with exemption of 143%. So obviously a lot of tariff on China. But you can also, what I wanted to show in the bottom, you can see the trade agreements that China has with other countries. So it doesn't just show you what the tariff is on US goods, you can compare it to what your competing nations tariffs have. So that's kind of unique to the US Deck. Again, if you're a member, it's under Volume 1. It's a great resource to use, and it's very simple. I'll go to the next slide. So really, in summary, don't shy away when tariffs are announced. Dig deeper, get an understanding. There may be opportunities to be uncovered. Innovate, adapt, communicate, be ready to make that move if a window opens. But in order to do so, you need to stay in touch with your buyers and keep those relationships alive. Then protect yourself with the insurance, especially on payment, and be nimble. Don't take it as a end all do all tariffs can be an opportunity, especially as these negotiations start. There can be some windows that could be really profitable for you. So yeah, it could be the catalyst for strategic action. So we'll see how this plays out. I just wanted to remind everyone as well, I am available for a resource. So if you have any questions, please reach out. I am here to essentially help you navigate through this space.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jackie. One thing I just wanted to remind our dairy processors here in Wisconsin, we do have a grant that is funded by the Department of Ag, Trade and Consumer Protection that funds consulting hours with Jackie. So if you're interested in participating in that program, please send me an email. Again, if you're a dairy processor here in Wisconsin, let me know if you're interested in getting some consulting hours with Jackie. She is happy to work with you on anything export. So yeah, definitely reach out to me. With that, let's get started on Q&A. I do have a few questions here that we have that were submitted ahead of time to get us started. You can submit those questions in the chat or definitely unmute if you have something that comes to mind. I'm going to do that thing where I make sure that you can see my screen again. Yeah, back up. Okay. So the first question, what do I do if tariffs get imposed and I have a product in transit and the customer backs out on the order? I think that's a Jackie question. Thoughts?
I'll take that one. Yeah. So a big one is have a plan B. You know, this is an unfortunate situation, and that's where the credit insurance plays a key role to ensure that, you know, if the customer is not going to pay for your goods, you still are covered. But also there are ways to either get the product back. So understand the process of returning product back to the US so you can sell it back within the country. But you can also, in some cases, re-export it to other nations. That's where traders and distributors are more experienced in doing this kind of thing and can be a good resource. And often they'll find a home for you and make you an offer. And then you can essentially go back to your credit insurance and say, hey, you know, I was able to sell it for this much into a different market. And then they'll essentially cover the difference for you. But again, that's why really do not send anything overseas in this market without having that credit insurance in place.
Makes sense. Okay, what do USMCA exemptions really cover? Do we know what dairy products are being charged coming in from Canada or Mexico or going out? See, is this a Chuck question, maybe? Is this an Andy question?
I can give it a go, but Andy, that's a muted no, I guess.
Yeah. Well, you know, Jacqueline said, here's the place where you go for all the information. So I'd say, no matter what any of us says, you better make sure you look at your product on that chart. But I'm happy to defer to those who are actually involved in trading.
Yeah, I guess I've always felt it's looking through the harmonized tariff schedule of the United States is maybe not one of the most fun things to do. And you almost need a legal degree, I think, to be able to navigate through that. So it's great that there are resources available to help with that. My reading of what that USMCA exemption says is that the tariff rates that are listed in Chapter 4 of the harmonized tariff schedule that cover dairy products and some other animal products essentially say that most of the product that come in from Canada or Mexico, and in this case, Canada would be more important quantitatively, are going to still come in at the free side. So imports into the United States still abide by the rules of USMCA. There's also a quantitative restriction side to that that's actually in a whole different chapter, 98 of the harmonized tariff schedule, that lays out how much can come in every year from different locations. But it appears to me now, and I'd be happy to have anybody correct me if I'm not getting it right, that product coming in is being treated as it would be under USMCA, and it's product going out that we have a little bit different treatment, at least on the Canadian side so far, but not on the Mexican side.
Okay. The estimated impacts on trade from the modeling work seem large for just tariffs from China and Canada. Why are the impacts that large?
I guess that's definitely a me question, although maybe
Yes.
I can make a hand motion like this and send it over to Andy. But part of that's reflecting the fact that there is a broader set of expected macroeconomic effects from having a broad system of tariffs in place that don't apply just to dairy. So the economic science is always a little bit imperfect, but there have been suggestions that we'll actually see an appreciation of the dollar. We'll see higher interest rates here in the United States than would otherwise. We'll see increased costs for equipment imports and some disruption of supply chains. So if we just looked at the volume of product that would move between China and Canada without the tariffs and compare it to the kinds of impacts that we're seeing, that wouldn't seem nearly so dramatic, but it's this broader context of changes in exchange rates that are going to make it more difficult for the United States to export all products, not just dairy products, as a result of a stronger dollar and higher interest rates. Those macroeconomic effects that we're still sort of waiting for those to play out, really have a bigger role to play in what those impacts look like than just the specific country-to-country tariffs that we're looking at here. So it kind of suggests there's this broader context that affects all trade, and that can be seen in the kinds of impacts that we're seeing with China and Canada, specifically for dairy.
In my presentation, I had where I talked about the Smoot-Hawley stuff. I didn't make a big deal about it, but there was a little verbiage there that talked about how do we compare 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% tariffs across gazillion countries versus China at 125, 145, and Canada and Mexico at around 25. That's on the other side of the coin. That's what we charge them. But as Chuck was saying, what we're thinking about with dairy impacts is what do they charge us for bringing stuff in? And I would simply say it's the same arithmetic in that if you're going to put a gigantic double the cost tax on your biggest trading partner and a pretty darn big one on your second biggest trading partner or whatever in the ranks, that's going to be really potent. You could double our tariffs to Vietnam and who cares? But we're talking about our biggest trading partners, and that ramps up pretty quick at these values.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so I have one come in to the direct chat. I think this is a Jackie question. So it has to do with, and I don't know if there's an answer to this, Jackie, so good luck. And I'm going to try to summarize it as I understand it. So it's good to get, it's like when you're paying tariffs, it's like a paying tariff question. So if you're buying goods and you get charged a tariff, and then the tariffs change quickly, right? So like on a Saturday, you get a good comes to you and the tariff bill is there, but then on a whim, the tariff rates change. And let's say they go down. If I haven't paid that tariff yet, at what point is the tariff I'm charged hell? Like at what point am I charged the tariff? Is it when I make like at what point is that the tariff? Is it when I order it? Is it when the goods hit US soil? Is it when I get it? Is it when I get ready to pay? Does that make sense? Like at what point is it the tariff?
Yeah.
And then who decides that? Is there a decider? Who's the decider?
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
It's typically when you clear the goods. So when you file the customs clearance and you get invoiced by customs, that's when the tariff hits and that's when the tariff is due.
Okay,
And
so when you get
unfortunately,
that,
if-
that's when it is, even if it goes down the next day.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. Okay, that's good, because that actually was a question that a group of us were talking about at CheeseCon last week. Amazing. Okay, thank you for that. So with that, it is exactly 2 o'clock. So I want to commend my speakers for sticking exactly to their time. I'm actually going to wrap up on my end and going to kick it over to my best bud, Rebecca Sweeney, because this last slide is about her webinar that's next month. So thank you everyone so much for joining us. Rebecca?
Yeah, we just want to invite you all to join us again on May 22nd for our next free members only webinar, which is focused on the growing prevalence of mental health challenges in the workplace. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And we want you to know that employers play a really critical role in fostering workers' well-being. So join us to learn about the unique stressors facing dairy industry employees, how mental health impacts workplace productivity and safety, and learn all about practical resources available to support your team. Dr. Catherine McCoy of the Wisconsin Department of Health Services, Bureau of Environmental and Occupational Health, will share actionable strategies, no matter where you're operating in the country, to promote a culture of mental wellness, reduce stigma, and connect employees with necessary support. You can register now at whizcheesemakers.org. Danica, back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for joining us. Watch for a follow-up email with the recording and the resources that Jackie shared. We will be in touch, and please register for that webinar in May. Also, one little plug, watch for it. I saved the date for our fall export work group, which will be either the last week of October or mid-November. Thanks everyone.